The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As my colleague, the Honourable Nanaia Mahuta, has already said, the Labour Party is supporting this bill to Select Committee. Mr Speaker, it seems that there are some sensible extensions to the powers of DOC officers to intervene so as to prevent or stop offending, and the granting of a power of arrest. I note with some interest that Clause 38(4) of the bill applies Part 4 of the Search and Surveillance Act 2012 with any necessary modifications to the exercise of those powers. That's important. One of the things that the 2012 Search and Surveillance Act tried to do was to make sure that where search and surveillance powers exist across the various arms of government, the same underlying rules apply. So it's good to see that these extensions to wildlife powers are made subject to the relevant parts of the Search and Surveillance Act. The note that that is in the explanatory portion of this bill, explanatory note, says that the Wildlife Act classifies and provides for the management of New Zealand's land, freshwater and marine species, but does not apply to domestic animals, birds, marine mammals, freshwater fish or plants. At least in respect of the freshwater species that we're left dealing with, I presume they include some of our rarest species. I'm not sure where the remaining habitat is for our increasingly rare frogs, but they will be covered by the Wildlife Act 1953. And in respect of water, I think it behoves me in taking a call here in relation to what is attempting to improve the conservation of protected species. It's to be noted that if you haven't got clean water, it's very hard for these species, particularly frogs actually, who are very susceptible to pollution, to survive. And I was somewhat dismayed at the answer of Nick Smith at question time today when he answered a supplementary question from me which tried to drill down to what is the actual effect of the National Policy Statement on fresh water quality, and I think he misrepresented the true effect of the National Policy Statement that we have. Now, that instrument was promulgated by the National Party after they had spiked the version of a National Policy Statement they inherited that had been proposed and just about finished by the prior government, but popped out the end of the review process that is provided for under the Resource Management Act, normally overseen by an Environment Court judge, and that time overseen by the former Principal Planning Court judge, Judge Shepherd. The effect of that National Policy Statement, which was spiked, was to control increases in intensity in land use. Because as Dr. Nick Smith correctly said at question time today, the main source of increasing pollution of our rivers is no longer factories and factory pollution or council sewage outlets, most of which are now under control, and the remaining ones which aren't under control are being brought under control. The main cause of degradation of our waterways now is increasing intensity in land use, where more intensive farming systems, which include normally more fertiliser, more livestock per hectare, and often irrigation, means that the nutrient load and the livestock effluent load from those farming practices increases. And unless those farming practices are controlled by our planning laws and the likes of a National Policy Statement on fresh water quality, the National Policy Statement is ineffective to halt the decline in our quality of the water in our rivers. And the National Policy Statement that Nick Smith promoted, the government promoted in substitution for the Judge Shepherd one that they spiked, that they did not proceed with, has as a legislated minimum with the associated national environmental standards, wadeability rather than swimmability, and then manages rivers as collections of rivers within a catchment rather than applying to each river. So, in fact, the effect of the National Policy Statement that the National Party says was great progress, the effect of it is to allow the continuing degradation of rivers in New Zealand so that they, even if they are currently swimmable, they do not have to be maintained in that swimmable state. And because of the lack of control on non-point source point source discharge is the sort of diffuse pollution that you get from more intensive farming systems. We have, 8 years after this government came to power, continuation of the decline in freshwater quality in our rivers. I see it down my way a lot. I travel around the South Island and indeed the North Island a lot, as most MPs do. I've long had an interest in water quality, and actually I was, counsel for a large number of the water conservation orders that lie on South Island rivers. So I do know my stuff around this. I'm also a swimmer in rivers. I'm a fisherman, a freshwater fisherman, and a tramper. And I feel well able to tell this House with some sadness that I am witnessing the continuing decline in rivers that I used to swim in, and I was very confident that I wasn't going to get ill. Those rivers now are increasingly degraded. Not all of them, but far, far too many of them. Some of the worst rivers, of course, are on the lowland, the east coast lowland rivers in Canterbury and Otago are increasingly degraded, particularly in Middle and South Canterbury, but also in other parts of the South Island. And sir, that is what this government will be focusing its attention on if it really was trying to look after the biodiversity values and the wildlife that are to be found in those habitats. Because without the habitat protection, the wildlife cannot thrive, and these powers of arrest that we're granting wildlife officers under DOC to stop people, illegally taking natural wildlife can never be applied if there's no wildlife to be taken. And the sad reality is that because of this, I think, absolutely irresponsible attitude by the current national government, who on this issue I think is too much in league with the farming lobby who vote them into power. I think it's irresponsible. New Zealanders don't want a lot of things, but I think two of the things that they're really clear on is that they should own their own land and their rivers should be clean. And on both of those very important metrics, this government falls down. Further, in respect of, and the Speaker will probably tell me to stop digressing too far into land issues. You are getting but it's terrible that some of the dairy farmers who've caused these water quality problems now want to sell their land to overseas buyers, which is a terrible thing. Sir, I think the water degradation in New Zealand is a terribly serious thing. I think we need to go back to the Judge Shepherd National Policy Statement, which essentially provided that clean rivers ought not to be allowed to get dirty, and dirty rivers ought to be cleaned up over a generation. It had powerful provisions in it that related to the control of increases in land use intensity, which we still don't have. It's interesting that the Fish and Game Council, which is New Zealand's largest NGO concerned with fresh water, was so distraught at the ineffectiveness of the Land and Water Forum, partly because the government cherry-picked some of the recommendations, but also partly because they were being effectively closed down within that. They've withdrawn from the Land and Water Forum. The latest report from the Land and Water Forum, adopted by the government, has the date, well, this is about protecting our wildlife, has the date for fencing our streams against dairy beef and other beef cattle in 2030. Hasn't learnt the mistakes from what happened with the dairy boom that came along so fast and degraded our rivers. The dairy boom's over, but the beef boom is now on. So what do? They let beef farmers have their cows, their dairy cattle in our rivers until 2030 in respect of the mid-country, 2025 in respect of the lowland country. Mr Speaker, so I'm happy to support this bill, but I've got to say, in respect of the serious issue of protecting the habitat of this wildlife, it will have no effect whatsoever, and habitat protection is what needs to be addressed most. Very good.